Hello, everyone. This is Thor. Today, we're going to be talking about karmic relationships, or what people have been terming simply a relationship with a karmic. That's really what we're going to be discussing today. And a lot of those relationships, a lot of us have been in one or another, but they tend to be the relationships that leave us feeling very confused and drained because the energy is very one-sided in most of these relationships. In Vedic astrology, it's believed that everything in your life, whether it be your career, your relationship with your family, the car you drive is all related to your karma from your hundreds or thousands of past lives that you've lived. So if you find yourself in a pattern of negative, toxic relationships, you can pretty much be assured that it's going to be part of your karma in your astrology birth chart. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. For those of you that are new to my channel, please like and subscribe and click the notification bell for all the notifications when I drop new videos. And also, if you are interested in a personal private reading, please check details down below. I'll have some information down there if you are interested in that. So let's talk about karmic versus soulmate because they are two different ideas. When we're talking about soulmates, I want you to be aware of really even the karmics can be a soulmate of sorts. But for this video, I want you to be aware of that soulmate is typically seen as a partner where there's equal give and take and there's a mutual exchange of energies. They also tend to feel safe, they feel secure, and there isn't an element of insecurity in these relationships. So they tend to feel very restful, very secure, and stable relationships. So when we're talking about karmic relationships, we're talking about more of these unstable relationships where you feel like you're constantly chasing for somebody's validation. I'm sure many of you have been in one, or maybe you're currently in one. So we're going to give you some of the telltale signs on how to identify if you've ever been in one before. And it's going to be based on, especially if the malefic planets, Mars, Saturn, Ketu, or Rahu are involved. That's a lot of times when you know you're in one of these karmic relationships. So I have a slideshow for everyone. So let's take a look at my first slide here. So typically what I consider a karmic is somebody where there's some sort of painful lessons in life. And the theory is that a lot of times it's somebody that you've done something similar to in past lives. So that's why you're experiencing these themes of betrayal, cheating, neglect, invalidation, suffering. Narcissism's become a real popular topic nowadays. But usually if you're in a relationship with somebody like that, it's because it's some sort of reflection of some past life karma that you have. So one of the important things to always do is to admit that at least some of this karma is your responsibility in how you deal with it. Now, how do I know if I'm with a karmic? One of the biggest signs, especially when you're with one of the Rahu or Ketu karmics, is going to be you're always chasing the person. You always feel like you're trying to chase for their attention. Maybe you're sending them messages. Maybe you're calling and they just kind of call you or text you very sporadically. They might be missing for days and then they text you, days later. That's all sign of a negative karmic pattern when we're looking at these relationships. So more about karmics, they usually have an addictive quality about them. It's like you can't get enough of this person. So I'm sure many of you have been in one of those relationships, but there's always this, you can't get enough. And then there's this feeling of insecurity, like they could take off at any moment. That's very common in these relationships. And one is always trying to obtain the karmic. There's an element of insecurity, like I said. And there's a lot of emotions when you're involved in a relationship with a karmic, like jealousy, envy, control, anger, addiction. And a lot of these are caused and they're a reflection of a lack of self-love. And of course, when we're talking about self-esteem and a lack of self-love, a lot of times that is indicated in the birth chart. For example, when we see Saturn aspecting the sun in your chart or aspecting the moon in your chart, sometimes there's these ideas of invalidation that may have happened within a childhood, and you carry this low self-esteem into your adulthood, and that affects you in your karmic love and romantic relationships. So let's talk about the specific karmas involved when you're actually in one of these toxic relationships. So we're going to be talking about Rahu, we're going to be talking about Saturn, we're going to be talking about Mars and Ketu, because all of these are negative or what they consider cruel planets that really have a really difficult type of life lesson associated with them. So let's take a look at some of these qualities of the relationships. The Rahu relationship can be one of the most confusing when we're trying to look at relationships, because Rahu has this mesmerizing quality. So you might meet this person, they're very mesmerizing. You might think that you've really won the jackpot with this person, and then they suddenly become this hot and cold dynamic. All of a sudden, you feel all this love from them, and then all of a sudden it gets very cold and they get very distant. That's typical of a Rahu situation. So let me share the slide with you so you can get a better understanding of what a Rahu relationship looks like. So Rahu's definitely going to be the constantly chasing. That's a signature Rahu, because usually you're going to be in the position of Ketu, and Ketu is the one that was, remember, in the legend, Ketu was the tail that got cut off of Rahu when Lord Vishnu threw his discus. So there's this feeling of constantly chasing and not being validated. Being ghosted often is usually a sign of Rahu. Rahu also usually indicates relationships where the person is deceiving you in some way. Maybe they're already married, or maybe they're already in a relationship and they're not being truthful about that. That's typical of Rahu karma. You're always looking for their approval when you're in a Rahu relationship. And like I said before, there's this mesmerizing quality. For example, you may think this person seems very successful. They might have the appearance, they might have a nice clothing on, a nice appearance, look very attractive, seem very charming. But then if you do a background check and you really look at their life is pretty much not in control. Like, they might not have any type of job. They might not have a place they're living. Even though they're presenting this image of their life is in control and they have everything together. When you do some checking, you might find out the Rahu persona actually doesn't have their life together. Let's go to the Saturn karma. Saturn karma is a little different. So Saturn, there's usually a feeling of obligation in these relationships. There's a feeling of you have to be with this person. Sometimes the feeling is because of family pressure, especially if you live in a nation where there's like arranged marriages and so forth. And there's also societal pressure. Sometimes this pressure can come from families, just when a couple have been dating for a while and one of the families just says, like, why aren't you married yet? And there starts being a lot of questioning and kind of a push in that direction of the couple needs to get married. A lot of times there's some Saturn karma involved there. Now, the relationship with Saturn karma usually feels loveless. It feels like it's done out of obligations. It feels very by rote. And the other person in the relationship might seem very uncaring, very cold, and they're only concerned with work and duty. And oftentimes this person is actually really working. There really isn't any deception like with the Rahu person. This person could actually be working quite a bit, and trying to make ends meet is very important. The other idea with Saturn is that there's this idea of isolation with a Saturn person, that you just don't see them a lot. And so it feels like you're very alone, even though you're in a relationship. So it has a very odd feel to it. However, there are Saturn relationships that have tremendous endurance. And when you see one of these aspects on your house of marriage in your chart, I don't want you all to think that it means it's totally bad. Saturn karma can be fine with a relationship. For example, if you have Venus aspecting the marriage house, or if you have Jupiter aspecting the marriage house, it actually can be a relationship that's really good and both partners really commit to the vows they made and it lasts a very long time. So you have to look at it, all the aspects of the relationship before you judge it with just one aspect. And let me take you back to the slideshow here. Mars karma. These are relationships where there can be lots of extreme ups and downs. I tend to think of these as those relationships where there's a couple that's very passionate and then they argue quite a bit. You've ever seen one of those relationships? That's typically a lot of Mars karma involved. Sometimes there's even Rahu karma involved with all of that. There can be restlessness or bickering in the relationship. Usually this is called Kuja dosha, and I've talked about this in a few of my videos, but there's this restlessness. The partner cannot sit still. They are always on the move. So you might see that they're always having to move. They can never just sit. So if on the weekend, they have to be out. They can't just be at home, just being at home and being very calm and contented. The idea of going on a retreat would be very anathema to a Mars person. The partnership can seem like a competition of sorts of who's going to win the next argument. There's this competitive thrust to the relationship. And the partner might also have a temper and be very volatile. So I want you all to be aware of that. Out of all four of these relationships, I feel like the Mars relationship is actually the most fixable, or the one that's easiest to work with, because when you have the Mars karma, a lot of times it's just about giving each other a lot of space, having an outlet for that restless energy, which could be sports, yoga, martial arts. So there's remedies for the Kuja dosha. So I feel like out of these toxic relationships that I'm talking about, the Mars one is probably the lesser one, unless you're in a really strong Mars situation, of course. So let's talk about our next relationship, which is a Ketu relationship. And this relationship can be rather perplexing as well, just like we were talking about the Rahu relationship can be perplexing. So let's go to the slides here. A Ketu relationship is a very unattached relationship. So one hardly notices their partner. And this can be apathy even from, for example, if you're the one in the relationship, you might even be feeling very unattached to this person. A lot of time, a Ketu relationship, it does kind of feel like a Saturn relationship in some ways. It can feel like the partners are just roommates. There's hardly any love there. There's hardly any attachment there. And it's just really just one little thing for the relationship to break apart. So a lot of times they're just staying together because it's convenient for them at the moment. So let's take a look at this. More of a relationship of convenience, often a loveless situation. Partner is barely part of one's life. Lots of escapism, and partners are always apart doing separate things. Because Ketu represents, what it represents is there's like this scattering effect that Ketu has, or there's this apathy that it has. So there's this idea of both partners are kind of just looking to do their own thing. Ketu is a very spiritualizing planet. It's one of the karmic nodes, but it's not really good in relationships. So even if, for example, if you are running one of the Ketu period, you might be more interested on going spiritual retreat or going on a pilgrimage or something like that, and not really spending the time you need to cultivate a healthy relationship. So that's the danger with being in a Ketu period. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share with you an example chart. We're actually going to be looking at Pamela Anderson's chart. For those of you that were around in the 90s, that was a very big deal when Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee got married. They had only known each other for about 4 days, and they got married, and it was a very tumultuous type of relationship, a lot of paparazzi and everyone wanting to know what's going on. And then Hulu, I believe, recently had a series about Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee's relationship. So I'm going to point out the chart for you, and we're going to look at a few factors in the chart here. So let's pull up Pamela Anderson's chart. And first of all, if we take a look at the chart, usually And this is, by the way, Pamela Anderson's, it was her first marriage with Tommy Lee. I did the research on that. But you'll notice that the first marriage, especially the first marriage, is represented by the seventh house. There actually isn't any negative aspects on the seventh house. It would seem like it's okay, right? Mars isn't aspecting the seventh house. Rahu and Ketu are not involved. And then Saturn is not aspecting the house either. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's 9 houses away. It's not aspecting. So you would think, well, it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with this relationship. However, I want you to be aware of, I'm going to show you the other way of looking at the relationship, because that's only one little thing. The seventh house is only going to represent how the public sees you. It's going to be very, that's not a really full picture. What you really need to look at is from your moon sign. So you look at your moon sign and you count 7 houses from moon, and this is going to give your idea, this is going to give the intimate details on what the native actually feels from inside the marriage. Look at this. This points quite a different picture. So if we can imagine, this is Pamela's, side of the equation, and then this is Tommy Lee's side of the equation. You see all that going on. So we got Rahu here, we got Moon here, and so the Rahu Ketu effect, it creates that relationship that has a lot of ups and downs. So I can assure you that there was a lot of chasing and toxic kind of notions in this relationship. The Rahu created a relationship where they got married after only 4 days. That's Rahu. Okay. So let me clean this up a lot. So very tumultuous, probably a lot of lack of validation within the marriage, even from Pamela Anderson's point of view, just because of this. And after a while, it probably just fell apart because of this idea of what Ketu represents. Just people stop caring after the initial romance. It kind of just fades out really quickly. The other thing we have to look at is you also look at the house number. So the 6th house in a chart, it can represent things like addiction, toxicity, arguments, or a feeling of betrayal in the relationship as well. So very likely, I didn't study the relationship too much, but sometimes when the 6th house is involved, there could be things like cheating or betrayal of some sort in the relationship. But 6th house definitely represents some sort of toxic scenario going on. That's an imbalance to the well-being of who the native is. So because this relationship's represented by the 6th house, 6 from moon, it's this idea of this is very toxic to the actual core identity of who Pamela Anderson is. So that's something to be aware of. Now, if we clean up the chart for a second, the other indicator you can look at when you're looking at if you're in a toxic relationship, specifically like a long-term committed or marriage, you also want to look at the D9 chart, which is called the Navamsa chart in Vedic astrology. And the thing we notice is you look at the 1st house, you look at the 7th house, because this is the marriage axis. And this represents a first marriage. You'll notice Mars is there in the 1st house, and Mars rules the 8th house. So it had also, besides having the Rahu and Ketu aspects of the marriage that we talked about, it also has this Mars aspect. And the Mars can create the restlessness or the bickering that happens in a relationship. So likely there was an experience of the relationship was always on the move. It was really restless. And then because Mars is the 8th lord in the Navamsa chart, there's also this idea of lots of sudden shocking things. They had a lot of secrets exposed during that relationship. So I remember that was a big deal. So there was this idea of not being able to keep a secret during the time. So there was also a lot of trauma having to do with that within the relationship. So those are a few things you can look at when you're analyzing a relationship to see if there's any toxic situations going on in that relationship. So the biggest thing in resolving these kind of karmic relationships is, number 1, having boundaries. And then number 2, also having a sense of self-love and high self-esteem. Those are the ways to remedy against getting into a lot of these toxic relationships. Because remember, in Vedic astrology, these people are mirroring back to you some sort of quality that is dormant within yourself. So if you can actually complete that karma within yourself, then you won't have to keep on dealing with this situation over and over again. So thank you so much for listening and watching this video. Let me know what you think of this and what we talked about down below in the comments. And also let me know, have you ever been in one of these type of relationships? Tell your story down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.